Welcome to The World According to Craig, where I interview and talk to people who have something far more interesting to say than I do. And on today's show, we welcome Raj Singh. CEO of National Lampoon and a close friend in most days when I'm not making fun of him. So thanks for joining us, Raj.
Every day.
Every day. Valid.
Thank you.
And I know today we're going to be talking about the intersection of comedy through a multicultural lens in today's landscape, which you're navigating in your current role. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, I would like to help people understand a little bit more about how you got where you are, like how you ended up, because we basically plucked, you know, this Indian kid from White Bread, Minnesota, right? Like you grew up in a not diverse community.
Sure. You want me to go all the way back?
Yeah, let's go all the way back.
Let's do it. Like you said, I grew up in Minnesota. My folks immigrated there from India.
Okay.
They came over for grad school. And, you know, of all places, who would have thunk you go from India to there? But it was, it provided the most opportunity. And that was, you know, always the sort of motivating factor for that generation. So I was born and raised there. I grew up there, went to college there, actually.
University of Minnesota. You keep saying you're a Michigan fan, but you're actually a Gopher. Is that correct?
Are other people going to hear this? Yeah. My fellow Gophers. That's right. I went to the University of Minnesota.
Were you raised in a traditionally Indian household? Or was it a combination of Western and Eastern traditions?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I would say we did our best to assimilate where we thought it made sense. And, you know, as the first generation born here, we wanted it all to be Western. The whole idea of being Indian and different when you're super young, you don't want that.
Right.
You want to fit in. And so there was a sense of pride in where we came from, but at the same time, you know, even just what we ate for dinner every night, we always wanted pizza or pasta or macaroni or whatever it was, and not, you know, naan with,
right,
you know, whatever, butter
naan with cheesy bread or whatever,
exactly.
Like everyone loves.
Exactly.
So it's fine. But it wasn't quite as multicultural back in the 80s, I guess.
That's right.
In that vein. So you're growing up in the 80s, you're balancing these traditions, but no one in Minnesota was around, was like you, or was there like a community of Indian immigrants in Minnesota that you associated with at the time, or were you the lone brown kid in the white school?
They sort of banded together. So, and that was more of, again, a generational thing. So all the people from my father and mother's generation all kind of sort of came together, right? Okay. It was like a magnetic effect because there were only so many in this far-flung place. Where we grew up in this suburb of Minneapolis, there were none. I mean, we were the only, really any people of color, more or less. I mean, there were a few, you know, here and there, but it was we were a unique flavor.
Was there a moment was there a moment where it stood out to you that way, or was it just sort of life, right? Like you lived life. I mean, I think people have sort of wildly disparate experiences.
Sure. I had one of my best friends grew up next door to me, and they had from the outside looking in, it almost seemed like the Brady Bunch, right? And you see that, and you hang out, and you go over there and play, and then you come home.
Did you throw a football into somebody's face and like break a nose? Like we're gonna carry the Brady Bunch all the way.
His sister may have at some point been subject to some injuries, sports related, but it was an easy juxtaposition because you saw this all-American family right next door to us, and then we had our own sort of traditions and practices at home. And all along, as you know, I used to wear a turban. I had longer hair. So
right, because you're Sikh.
That's right. And so every day when I looked in the mirror and was at school or amongst friends, I knew there was something slightly different about me.
Well, you were wearing a turban. I'm guessing it was not common.
Yeah, I saw the differences, and I think that's where I drew from to kind of fit in, because for my folks, it was a first-time thing to come to this new place and raise a family.
And you didn't major in film producing, and not that there's a major for that in most places, and there certainly wasn't then. You didn't major in content producing, but now you're CEO of National Lampoon, and you're in charge of resuscitating a franchise, right? Probably the most formidable franchise in comedy history. Did you just draw that out of a hat? Was this like the sorting hat at Hogwarts? Like it was like somebody got Gryffindor, somebody got Hufflepuff, you got National Lampoon. Like, is this where was this where you intended on going?
You know, I think
because you don't write comedy. You're not very funny.
You don't know that, though. It's just not public yet, but soon enough. But I always loved movies. That's where it began. Movies and TV, actually. And I saw everything growing up. And I always had an interest in working in the industry, but I didn't really know how to go from Edina, Minnesota to Los Angeles, California, and do it in a smart way. And so what I did was I took a safe route out of school, which was investment banking and private equity. And what that does, on the one hand, is actually teach you a lot about just how to look at the world.
Right.
And so
through a monetary lens.
Yeah, that's right. Monetary does come first, but you get a great vantage point. And so it allowed me to form a better understanding of business and product, and then look to the entertainment business and see how I could potentially, segue into it. And
so you came across the Kmart of entertainment properties, something that was once amazing,
sure,
and all over the country and saturated with really high brand recognition, but was at that point Kmart, right? Like there were like some people had maybe not managed it well.
Correct. And that's where it was great that I had the investing background, because had they managed it right and done their job, some studio would own it.
Right.
And instead, the business faced issues, it floundered, they had liability they had to manage. Someone had to come in after it was cleaned up and kind of really breathe life into it again. And so everything I learned in the investment business actually came into practice with National Lampoon.
Okay.
And up until that point, my experience in the business had been financing and producing film, which was a great learning experience for this, but that's one picture at a time. This is we're talking about,
a franchise, a brand.
Exactly.
So how there's sort of a double layer of this, which is like, how do you reboot a franchise and how do you reboot a franchise now?
Sure.
Right. So you started rebooting it before the current sort of social justice wave, right? But you were looking through a multicultural lens. You had like a young group of diverse up and comers who were amazing, and you did the National Lampoon Radio Hour, and you're looking to all these properties in the future that sort of represent what it stands for.
That's right. That's right. So the best way to describe it is the way we looked at it was, here you have something that had 47 years of life at that point. And when you have that kind of built-in awareness and audience, you have some flexibility in terms of what you can do with it, because you don't have to go get the audience. There's some audience that exists that grew with the brand.
Okay.
And when they were dormant, which is when we stepped in, it had probably aged out of a group. So, call it younger millennials, and Gen Z isn't so familiar with it.
Right.
But for
Cats. I mean, everybody knows like some of the movies, but maybe they've forgotten about all of the really crappy parts and they just remember the good ones.
And that's it. It's whatever's playing on cable or at the time, or now streaming. You see all the vacation films and whatever it is. So we had something to work with, and yet the whole sort of content landscape was shifting, and yet there was no sort of comedic powerhouse. There were these fiefdoms around all of the studios, mostly talent driven.
Right.
And this was really a label that was built on breaking talent.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because outside of SNL, which is a whole separate beast and is focused on a show, right, and a personality at the center of it, Lauren.
Sure.
But you have Lord and Miller, you have Judd Apatow. All the comedy franchises are very person creator based, and you're talking about something that is franchise and brand based in that vein. And then you're talking about this wave comes, right? Like, and in today's environment, and even before the current social justice movement, there's the number of people who've been canceled for something is very high, shall we say, right?
Sure.
And for, a tweet, something you tweeted 9 years ago that's taken out of context, and you find yourself apologizing over and over, and then your career's gone, your contract's gone, you're protecting a brand, right? You're not even a personal version of this. How do you handle comedy in today's environment? Like, is it even possible to have comedy in today's environment? If we dug out all the Richard Pryor jokes, right, and started reading them,
sure,
who gets fired first, right?
Right.
So what do you do? How do you even begin to approach that environment?
Yeah. And it's not a question that has a prescribed answer, right? I mean,
Tell me more.
And all about this, man, just navigating pitfalls and the definite don'ts, right? So then again, what is it that you do? Going back to one point you made while you were, sort of going through
on my rant. I'm usually on a rant.
I'm not going to say that. That wasn't a rant. You brought up the point of talent versus brand. And the reason this brand resonated so much is because the talent cared about the mission at the time. And at the end of the day, it's still all talent driven, whether it's a writer or a performer. Whatever the project is, film, TV, written word, stand up, it's somebody or somebody's behind it. In this case, they were able to harness all of this talent in one room and get them to do all these things before they became individual personalities. And then the brand sort of rode that wave and was able to attract talent, right, on a regular basis and make that the magnet. Early on, they were able to establish, and it becomes relevant for the question you posed, that there were no boundaries. And it was
that seems problematic.
It was jarring. It was anti-establishment. It was irreverent. It was all the adjectives.
That seems fine for 1960s,
70. Yeah, starting in 70.
Okay, 1970. So that seems fine then. Less fine in 2020, unless you're Donald Trump.
That's right. That's right. And where we know we can, and this is a purely business thing, where you can make money is in film, is in television, and a few other areas within media that we focus on, right? And even those sandboxes have parameters around them, right? It can only have so much of a rating. It can only draw this sort of talent if the script reads a certain way, right? So those are our built-in safeguards within that. What we want to see is fresh, different perspective, et cetera. And so if there's edge to it, if there's subversion, if there's if there's something that's controversial, we actually haven't, we've had maybe one screenplay so far where we looked at it and said, wow, this is really controversial, but we're really interested in it. We never actually ended up landing it. It became competitive, but that actually was indicative because that happened during cancel culture. So to me, that suggests that in that case of film, if the writing is tremendous, right? If it's got the entertainment, it has the satire, which is really important to us, satirizing what's going on. And cancel culture actually gives us a way to kind of make this almost meta, where we can take it one level further and cause a reason to sort of...
So you're going to cancel culture.
That's it. You could do that, right?
Okay.
I'm not saying that's our mission, but you could.
It could be somebody's mission. I mean, listen, I want people to be respectful of each other, and I want there to be a respect out in the world, and there to be laughter and comedy. But at the same time, I would also like people to calm the fuck down, right? Like, and so there's the vein of like, how do you balance that, right? So something can be subversive, but what happens if something is subversive and it's out there, and the audiences receive it and they love it, and there's a small group of individuals or a large group of individuals. Let's say you have, 10 million people love a new movie or a new screenplay, and 1 million people are offended by it. Like, do you make it? And if you do make it, what do you say to those 1 million people who are offended by it? Or do you say like, this is comedy, right? Like this is like, this isn't intentional harm. Like it gets very messy. And I think the world is intentionally, sometimes it's okay to be messy, but like, how do you navigate your way out of that?
Right. Well, it even goes one step further, which is what we're making causes a reaction one way or another. That wasn't funny. It was funny. And even that's subjective, right? And the same goes for anything. It could be drama, it could be thriller, it could be horror, whatever it is. Some folks are going to find it good. Some are going to find it bad. Now, if you're asking if a group or a cohort finds something offensive, right, and they just think it should be canceled, that's one thing. I think we haven't come across anything where I look at it and I say, this actually has risk of that. Now, if it did happen, well, all the safeguards are in place. There's usually a studio partner or network, right, that's greenlighting. There's us signing off, talent signing off, et cetera. So it's not like we have a unilateral decision, right? We're not one sole stand-up comedian going up there and making that joke. I've been in the room and nothing offends me. I'm just going to say it. Especially,
I know, I've tried, but it doesn't
from personal experience. But I've been at the store and watched comics come up and say things where the whole audience is like, did he just say that? And I feel it.
Do they recover?
Oh, of course. They know they're going there. They know they're going to get that reaction. And then they just go further, right, often, and then come back out. And then it feels like no one could openly, say consciously that this is how they enjoy it. But it's like going on that roller coaster. You go up and you go down and you go up and you kind of want it, but you don't want to acknowledge that you want it because you go there for entertainment. If that entertainment can also push you and pull you in different directions, it's more of a ride. It doesn't mean, just offend the shit out of people, but
well, it's almost like
watching it happen and feeling the goosebumps and seeing everyone around you just do that. He just said that.
True. Yeah, most people, when I walk into a room, it's that chill. It's like the Game of Thrones theme that plays, but I think it's a different impact. It's not quite right. Comedy. But, I think there's something to be said for that, which is, when people are in their personal social circles, they get okay with their friends saying certain things. And if they're not, they address it, hopefully, right? Like, that kind of offended me for this reason. You didn't know this about me, but X, Y, Z. But in the vast majority of situations, I think people realize that their friends are coming from a good place, a trusted place. It's almost like when you go, is it the same thing? You go to the comedy store and you watch someone and this comic is up there trying to tell a joke, and they're coming from a place of like, they're not trying to be offensive for offensive sake, right? Like I often joke the sign of a bad screenwriter is how many fucks they put into a movie, because they just put them all over the place because they think it's being crazy, but the reality is restraint can be the sign of creativity, right?
Right.
So this comedian's not up there just to offend. They're there because this is their career, this is their job, but this is part of that, right? Like,
right.
Is it the same trust relationship? Is that like, do you go there and is that why it works? Because people trust each other, or is it just an expectation? I know I'm going to go to the comedy store and somebody's going to offend me and I'm going to laugh, right? And because I'm going to get it.
Well, I think that format kind of stands on its own because stand-up comics are more or less observers, right?
Okay.
They're almost, you could say, philosophers, right? Modern day. They look at anecdotes.
I don't know that I'm going to compare Chris D'Elia to Immanuel Kant.
I understand what you're saying, but if you take an anecdote from your life and it could seem so mundane, and you can turn it into a 15-minute bit
or a podcast, just to be clear.
Exactly, a half-hour podcast, and actually have observations, lessons learned, flipping the way expectation is perceived and experienced. There's something to be said about that, and it's all usually rooted in truth, because the better jokes are true, right? So that almost, to me, stands on its own, because you're paying for that. You're putting the money up. You're going to go have a couple of drinks, watch the show, maybe get offended, and then walk out and, I can't believe he said that, but how crazy was it, right? And then you move on.
So how do you translate that into a movie, right? Like, can you recreate that experience? Can a movie be offensive and funny in today's day and age, right? I mean, there are lots of jokes that we can crack that are going to be about your crazy Uncle Jim or your wild Aunt Maud, right? Like, there's lots of areas to play where there's less risk to offend.
Sure.
It's if you start cracking jokes about your crazy Uncle Jim being from the West Bank and your crazy Aunt Maud being from Jerusalem and interplay, like, things start to get hairy at that point, right? So can you create that? Is it like, can you create a movie with, like, outside of the safe realm, and in that environment, do you have the same thing? People are paying the $10 going into a movie, expecting this to be a journey. I mean, Borat is not offensive to the people who's watching it, but it's offensive to the people who got caught, I would suppose.
Right. That's right. And so I think oftentimes what you see in comedy is what's offensive is just going too far in terms of how gratuitous is it? How foul can it get, right? And it's sort of surface level. What we look for, and I frankly respect creatively, is when you can layer the story, right, with arc and narrative and character depth that ends in world creation, where you can actually go there, but it allows for it because you're not making it just to be offensive. You're making it to call out a situation, just like a comic does. So it's almost like doing it on a meta level. And those are really hard to come by, the writers that can actually create that experience. And so that's often the sort of the distinction between what we think can work in satire and what doesn't. Because if it's known that it's going to be Parasite, for example, that's satire, right? I mean, it's a tragic comedy, it's satirical, but it's also a thriller. It has
Everyone
all
loved
of
it.
it.
I couldn't get through it. I just have to be honest. I watched Madam Secretary on network television, and then Parasite. I'm just like, but I mean, I get it.
Do you understand, right?
Yes.
And he could.
I watched Snowpiercer, which was his earlier film, which was in the same vein.
And even those films are films that, if we had our druthers, would be National Lampoon films. Bong Joon-ho, the way he looked, director Bong, the way he looks at the world, the way he's able to comment on it, even though it's a very, no, I know, but even though
I'm fascinated by this business approach. I'm like, okay.
But even though it's no, if you actually contrast that to Vacation. As crazy as it might sound on the surface, how is it any different? Vacation is just, it's so much more sort of fastball in American cinema, but it satirizes family dynamics. It's just that it doesn't satirize rich versus poor in this one house and all these terrible things happen, right? So,
okay, so
do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, and so I'm going to take that one step further, which is there's a phrase, all politics are local, right? Which is, you can talk about tax breaks and macroeconomics and foreign policy, but I want to know if my roads are paved, if my schools have ceilings that are falling in. And I almost wonder if all comedy isn't local as well, right? Which is when you talk about this family dynamic, right? You talk about National Lampoon and the family of it all. You talk about the Parasite family. Even you talk about world building. You're essentially creating a world. Think about all the jokes that you tell among your family when you crack each other up. Like when we play game nights and there's just a joke after joke after joke. Sure. If somebody walked into the middle of that, they're not going to get it, right? Because they're entering the world with like a hard left turn.
Sure.
Right? It's like, whoa, it's like a smash in the face. But if you're part of it, the number of times that you could just find yourselves rolling on the floor with laughter with your family, with friends in silly, stupid moments. I think it's the whole premise of the heads up game, right? Is that like, it's supposed to create these silly, stupid moments that you get as a family. And some things are like, would out of context be crazy wild offensive, but there's that feeling of the family dynamic. You've built a world. Is comedy just a reflection of home life? Is that how we look at this in the world, right? Like the Richard Pryor jokes, Mrs. Maisel of it all, their observations of life, their observations of their lives. They've taken their lives, they've made it into something dynamic, and now it's really about my relationship to my own home life, my own world.
Sure.
Is that a proper way to look at it? Did I just solve everything?
You may have. And this should be in the instruction manuals for up and comers. But to me, comedy all just roots back to, and I said this just now, I think it roots back to truth. And it just depends on what truth are you telling. Are you Charlie Chaplin, who did all these silent films, and there's so much physical humor, which in and of itself is impressive. But that was very much commentary on society, right? I mean, all of that, if you really examine those pictures, you don't even have to, you just have to watch them. There's funny for funny's sake, and there's ongoing funny, like you're talking about, like the world building and walking into being part of a dynamic where you can actually, share in this. I think that's what you're almost asking the question, what makes a funny movie rewatchable, right? And that's the common thread, in my opinion. What makes it rewatchable is something that's, well, one, it's relatable. Two, you can get dropped into the world. Three, it's not surface level jokes, right? You can actually, it resonates, right, at a character level. And no matter how absurd it can get, you're still in it because you feel like you're a part of it, right? So it's escapism, to the next level. It's not going and seeing, explosions and superheroes.
Are all of your friends from Minneapolis and your parents, are they going to all watch the next National Lampoon? They're going to find it funny.
They don't have a choice. They're going to be a source of inspiration for the characters anyway. So, yeah,
I'm glad you have to tackle them before you tackle your current friend group, because I'm going to need some permission slips if I'm included as the inspiration for any character.
You need to sign away your some rights here for me.
Maybe not. Well, I think it's a fascinating topic, right? Like, we look at the world now and it can seem so crazy, it can seem so difficult. But I think what you've been talking about is it's actually not as complex. It's not as complicated as we would make it, right? Like, yes, there's a cancel culture out there, but it's not about that cancel culture. It's about just this story building, world creating mode of a personalized story that can entertain people. And if you come at it with the right intention, and you're not doing it maliciously, there's a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. There's a little bit of a contextual situation. Sure. And maybe Richard Pryor actually could make it today, or George Burns. I don't know. It depends on where they're going in that vein. But I'd like to think that we recognize the Joan Rivers, the comedic geniuses of the past, and say, okay, we could take an inspiration from them. We wouldn't just automatically rip them down.
Sure. Well, there's nothing, to use that example, Chris Rock or Dave Chappelle are not saying anything less edgy or controversial than Richard was. It was just that he was there early and he kind of laid the groundwork for, that's what I would observe. And, but yet those guys are already established comics. right? They're already grown-ups. They've been stars for decades. So it would be interesting to see that next Richard Pryor. I don't actually know who that is. I'm sure he or she is out there, but it's almost analogous to are movie stars dead, right? And in a different way.
Right.
Can there be another movie star?
Well, yeah, I almost wonder if you could stage a publicity stunt where you have someone read and do a Richard Pryor show to an audience that doesn't know Richard Pryor and see how they react, right? And film and tape that. If you take that idea, I'm going to require some payment, but
it's all yours. Well, I saw Jamie Foxx, I think it was Jamie Foxx, do an interview once where he said he was testing material, and I think this was recent. These guys these men and women are very cognizant of who their audience is. And he talked about how he changes the routine depending on where he is in the country, because you want your jokes to land, and you want to minimize, who you're offending.
So no Trump jokes in rural Tennessee. Understood.
Yeah, I don't know if he explicitly said that, but he'd probably agree. I think, public sentiment so well. This just demographics and publicity and marketing so well. There's no public meter for things that are subjective. So if 10% of people thought something was offensive, does that make it offensive? Or but on the other hand, if 60% of people thought something was immoral and offensive, then is it, right? And so where do you draw the line? And
well, there used to be the codes, right? And the codes are different. What qualified as PG in 1960 or as R rating in 1960 is PG rating today.
Sure.
Right? Like as society and mores have evolved.
Right, exactly. So it certainly evolves with the times, and then the times evolve with it, and I think they just push each other. What used to land then maybe doesn't land now. And like you said, is it local? Just like the news. Right. I've actually found it to be more universal than I thought, because when we were taking the time to look at the brand, kick the tires, one of the core tenets we'd always hear from folks is, well, it doesn't travel. Comedy doesn't travel. And take a Pixar film, for example. You would think that humor, those are adult films essentially, right? The way they're written and layered. The jokes in those films land just like they do here overseas. Now, we're still talking about animation and children, but there's something to be said about the fact that understanding the timing, understanding the beats, and watching audiences laugh in one far-flung place like India, right, with kids, that don't even know English versus here, that actually says something about
parents will always fight with their children. They'll always be crazy aunts and uncles. Exactly. There'll always be some dispute between neighbors, and it's just the layers that you put on it. Exactly.
So to me, it's more about relatability. Is there something in this film or story that can be sort of can be imprinted or transplanted wherever the it's being watched?
Got it. So best intentions, relatability. When in doubt, make fun of your friends, your aunts, and your uncle, and do it at home, and don't record it. Yeah. All good advice.
Somebody once told me, I met this venture capitalist, and he once told me 95%, people are 95% the same. And we have all these squabbles over that 5% where we're different. And it's very much, sort of analogous here.
Well,
right?
I love that. Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to National Lampoon reminding us of the 95% and not the 5%. So thank you for coming on today and having an honest conversation about something that I literally am fascinated about, this intersection of how the things we've always known, if they can still exist, how the world changes, how society changes. And so I'm so grateful to you for sharing what you're doing with National Lampoon, from your perspective growing up the way you did, and how that informs today and the culture. And cheers to universality of comedy. And I'll be first in line for the next National Lampoon film. So I really appreciate it.
You're paying full price, by the way.
I mean, we'll talk about that later. Right. Thanks so much to Raj for joining us to talk about the intersection of comedy and multiculturalism and what's possible in today's world. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of The World According to Craig. Tune in again for The World According to Craig with someone else who's smarter, better, brighter, and prettier than I am. Thanks for tuning in to The World According to Craig. The inside secret is not actually according to me. It's according to some of the most interesting people I know and their opinions on the things that affect us most. Together, we're just trying to make sense of the world, and I hope you'll join us every week.